My name is Justin Dela Cruz. I am the program specialist for the National Center for Data Services. And today we have our session on the NIH Data Management Sharing Plan Practitioner Perspectives on Infrastructure. This has been a series sharing information on the new NIH Data Management Sharing Plan requirements that will start next year. And I'm very happy today to be introducing our presenters, Heather Coates and Nicole Kontaxis, who will be sharing their perspectives on dealing with infrastructure within their institution to prepare for these upcoming requirements. Heather Coates is the Digital Scholarship and Data Management Librarian at the Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis University Library Center for Digital Scholarship, where she provides research data services and research metrics services to support faculty success. She also holds the appointment of Indiana University Data Steward for Research Data. In this role, she develops policy, processes, and resources to facilitate responsible stewardship of research data throughout the IU system. She is a co-founder of the Metrics Toolkit, a free resource to help scholars navigate the research metrics landscape. Nicole Kontaxis is our other presenter. She is the lead of the data discovery at the NYU Health Sciences Library. In this role, she collaborates with departments across the institution to develop the vision and strategy for data sharing and discovery initiatives, including the NYU Data Catalog. And she received her MLIS from UCLA and an MA in bioethics from NYU. So please welcome our presenters, and I'll turn it over to them.
Great, thanks, Justin. Heather, I am going to share our slides, and then we will get started. All right, Heather, can you see the slides? Great. So as Justin said, I'm Nicole Kontaxis. Heather Coates is here with us as well today to talk about infrastructure issues around the new NIH data management and sharing policy in 2023. We're going to cover a few things today. First, we're going to talk about infrastructure and the NIH policy sort of more broadly. Then we're going to talk about where we want to be and then where we actually are. So we're going to start with the dream and then come down to, waking up. And then we're going to end with how we want to move forward. So let's get started. I figured a good place to start is to come up with a shared definition of what is infrastructure. I think it's a word we use a lot and don't really define frequently. And what I'm just going to say it's a series of complex and interrelated systems that support human activities, broadly speaking. So research infrastructure can include things like lab space, eLab notebooks, grant application platforms, etc. I think an important part of this definition is not just the systems part, but the interrelated. So we're going to need to think about systems we use and the relationship between those systems. And it's both of those things that make up infrastructure, broadly speaking. And then these last 2 points are less parts of a definition and more important things to note. Infrastructure is easy to ignore when it is working well and impossible to ignore when it is working poorly. So, if you drive to work every day, you're not going to notice the road necessarily. You're not going to sit there and be like, oh, what a nice road that I rely on every day. But you're definitely going to notice it if there's a big pothole that you hit on your way to work. And the reason we included this is just, infrastructure can be a bit thankless. And it is important to think about what we're noticing and what we're not noticing when we work on an infrastructure related project. And lastly, infrastructure impacts communities as well as individuals. So if a road is closed and you can't get to work, that impacts you as an individual. But if your neighbor who is a baker, your other neighbor who is a doctor, another neighbor who owns a hardware store. If all of them can't get to work, what we're going to see is really a trickle-down impact of that failure of infrastructure. So when we're thinking about the impact of these projects, you need to think first level, like how are individuals affected, and then largely speaking, how the community is also impacted. So let's get to the NIH policy. There's a bunch of pieces of infrastructure that are going to be impacted or will be used in the process of being compliant with this policy. So some of these are data repositories, data standards, persistent identifiers, institutional grant support systems. NYU has one of these, helps researchers apply for grants. I'm sure many of you have similar systems, as well as DMP DMP creation support systems, which I'm really referring to DMP tool here. And there's a lot of other pieces of infrastructure that touch the NIH policy. These are just some examples. And then some notes about these pieces of infrastructure. So these are each built by different stakeholders. So sometimes it's by the university or research institution, excuse me. Sometimes it's by the NIH. Sometimes it's by third parties like community-focused work. And so we have a really vast array of people creating these sorts of projects. Each of these projects addresses different needs. So data standards can really help in the exchange of data, whereas data repositories more serve the need for long-term storage of data. So each of these pieces addresses different needs, and each of these are at different levels of completeness. And I just add that because we cannot assume static behavior from any of these pieces, right? There's going to be changes, growth. Some things might no longer be used. Some new things might come up. So we can't really see it's not a static ecosystem. So this is a lot of stuff that we could talk about, but we're going to talk about one thing, and that's the Machine Actionable Data Management Plan. The reason we're going to talk about this is, well, in part, the policy requires us to write plans, so that seems like an appropriate place to start, but also because an MADMP has the potential to tie together these diverse systems to help researchers navigate this rather complex data and research ecosystem. So the way I'm thinking about machine actionable data management plans, and Heather, please step in if you disagree on this, is just as a way to help researchers comb through all of this information and help them navigate these different pieces of infrastructure, and then also add another piece of infrastructure to the mix. All right, so let's talk about what is a machine actionable data management plan. I'm going to be very straightforward. I have talked about this in a lot of meetings, and it is hard to occasionally define and get everybody to the same level of understanding. So if you have questions about this, I will pause before we go to the rest of the presentation to sort of make sure we have a common understanding of an MADMP. But it is a conceptual framework that turns a data management plan into a free text static document into machine actionable information. So the hope here, let me just do, I'm not great at illustrations, but this should hopefully give you some idea, is to take it from being a PDF that sits on your computer. So in this illustration, Michelle Yee, who's one of my colleagues at NYU, she writes a DMP, it sits as a PDF on her computer, versus if we use her ORCID ID, we're able to differentiate her between other Michelle Yees, and then hopefully exchange the information in the DMP to other services. So effectively, what an MADMP looks to do is leverage tools like unique identifiers. So in this example, in ORCID, common data models. So RDA has a common data model, and controlled vocabularies to more readily exchange information in a DMP across these diverse pieces of infrastructure we've been talking about, in order to first better help researchers through different tools and services that they rely on, and then also to better track data provenance, attribution, and publication. Before we move forward, and Heather, if you can keep an eye on the chat for me, are there any questions on roughly how this would work? I'm assuming there are going to be questions, by the way, so.
We don't have any yet, so maybe
Okay.
we can pause it a bit. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, we have more time for questions at the end. Just know that this isn't necessarily an easy idea to grasp, so no shame in asking questions about it. Moving forward, we're going to talk about where we want to be. So I'm going to talk about NYU, and then Heather's going to talk about her institution. Great. So what I would like to do at NYU Langone is to use DMPs that are generated in the grant application process to accomplish two specific goals. The first is to ease communication between research support departments. So that includes the library, IT, the Office of Science and Research, the Office of Sponsored Projects, and others, by generating automatic alerts and tasks once grants are funded. The second goal being to ease communication between research support and researchers by alerting researchers to tools, trainings, and workflows for their research and data practices. What I want to note here is that these are my two goals for machine actionable data management plans at my institution. There are a lot of people working on machine actionable data management plans. Specifically, DMP Tool is doing a lot of work here. They're really addressing this larger ecosystem. What I'm talking about is NYU Langone specifically, and how I want to try to use this conceptual framework for the benefit of my institution. So as you think about this, I want to just really call to the fact that this is my approach at my institution. My approach would probably have to be very different at other institutions. And notably, one of the goals we're not looking at right now at NYU is to use machine actionable data management plans to track research outputs. I know there are people working on that, and I see that as a very important goal. But for our space at NYU Langone Health, I'm not trying to put myself in a position where research IT thinks I will track all the research data being put out by NYU. So we're stepping away from that side of machine actionable data management plans and really focusing on these goals of easing communication between departments and between researchers and research support departments. Now, I think we can do this by first understanding and leveraging legacy systems wherever possible. I pointed out earlier all the types of infrastructure involved in the NIH policy, or not all the types, but examples of types. And there's a lot of different systems in place at NYU that I think we can leverage in order to make data management plans machine actionable. But we have to understand what those are and make sure we're using them to the best of our abilities. Two, I think we can do this by prioritizing what gets made machine actionable and when. Again, speaking from a very personal standpoint, in the past, when I've thought about machine actionable data management plans, I've sort of taken an all or nothing mental approach, being like, oh, this data management plan is or is not machine actionable. The longer I work on this project, I realize that you can make things machine actionable piece by piece, particularly because of how these DMPs are written. And I'm trying to figure out which aspects of a DMP to make actionable and when. And I want to do it this way because I think this allows me to demonstrate to departments and leadership the value of machine actionable data management plans within their own realms, right? If I try to make everything machine actionable at once, this is a lot of labor, this is a lot of money, it's a lot of time. If I can prove it works piece by piece, it might actually get me some strategic buy-in from the people I need it from. And let me explain what I mean about that. So currently at our institution, if you want to request research-related software, this is usually how it goes. The researcher contacts Research IT, they request a specific piece of software. Research IT says, okay, we will begin our process. It's going to take us an average of 35 business days. And God help you if legal has to get involved because it's going to be a lot longer. Excuse me one moment. Okay. And then the researcher inevitably complains because they actually wanted it next week. And why can't we get it done more quickly? And so then the end result is our IT personnel is unhappy, our researcher is unhappy, sometimes the lawyer is unhappy. No one is happy. Here's what I would love to see happen is that when the researcher writes their DMP, they note which tools they will need for accessing and manipulating their data as required by the NIH. The relevant sections in the NIH DMP will be sent to Research IT as well as other research service departments when the grant is funded. So we already track when grants are being funded using our institutional grant support system. So hopefully we could tie these things together. So when it's funded, Research IT can get that section of the DMP that says, that gives information on software, and they can at least prepare for what's coming. And notably, in step 3, contact the researcher with questions on their specific needs to get started on IT acquisition ahead of their 35 days or longer business turnaround. Now, I do want to point out here, there's a lot of things to be figured out in this process. Exactly how much of the DMP to be sent to Research IT, if there would be ways to optimize that process, and who exactly would need to get notified for different sections and at what time. There's a lot here to be figured out, but the goal is that we go from our current process, which is ad hoc, difficult to follow, long, and leaves no one happy, and move us towards a process where we're better at communicating across departments, we're better at communicating with our researchers because we better understand the work that they're doing. So those are my dreams and goals and hopes. I'm going to hand it over to Heather. Heather, please just tell me when you need me to switch slides. I'll talk later about how it's actually going.
Okay, so I am going to sort of reverse the order in which Nicole talked. So I have to say, so Nicole has thought a lot more about machine actionable DMPs than I have. And it wasn't until our conversation that I really began to think about that incremental approach as something that we could actually do. So there's a saying I think that we often hear from folks within the Make Data Count initiative, which is "Don't let perfect be the enemy of progress." And I'm trying to take that philosophy here as we think about how could we improve our processes and begin to envision which pieces of data management and sharing plans could be machine actionable at IU. So here I have a very high level overview of our current process for basically anyone to get access to a third-party system. So we have this process called the SSSP, which is a software and services selection process, and it's really meant to guide researchers and other users to tools that are already in place. Then we have this 3PA process, which is third-party assessment. That's a security thing, and I'll talk more about the details. And then we have this final sort of process in which purchasing and sometimes legal counsel get involved. So this is analogous to the process that Nicole has described, but it just looks a bit different at IU. And if we could go to the next slide, please. So there's a bit more detail about each of these processes, but this is sort of the like chain in which researchers are often encountering unexpected obstacles. They want to use a third-party system to do their research. They are often encountering this process during the project startup phase, and we have a similar time frame. It could be anywhere from 3 to 4 business weeks or longer, depending on if we have to do a full security review, if critical data that are classified as critical are involved. And then all of that sort of feeds into what purchasing does in terms of the agreement, other kinds of agreements that get added on to any kind of purchase or license that's settled upon. So these things are linked, but are researchers aware of and do they understand the context in which this happens? Usually no, unless they've been through it before. So there are many, many pain points with this process as is. One of them is that this process is sort of built for all data domains. So the language, the terminology, the assumptions behind it do not specifically address the needs of researchers. So we have unclear terminology, or we have things that assume who might be completing these forms, and it just doesn't play out that way for research. Some of the most problematic issues we run into are that the expectations that researchers bring to this just don't align with the reality and the needs of the process because they don't know why this process exists. And then we also have some communication issues. As Nicole alluded to, the form that is used doesn't really elicit the information that's needed. And researchers often struggle to define or describe the information that we need to sort of move it along in the process. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So something that we have done um, over the last 8 to 9 months is pilot a streamlined process for research and health. So this is actually specific to human subjects research. So when a study or a protocol is submitted to the IRB, if they note that any particular tools or software are mentioned, they forward the protocol to us, and we begin this simpler, less automated, in fact, but this sort of simpler and more direct connection with the researchers. The other key piece of this is that the time frame is earlier on. So this is during IRB review. It's not the last couple of weeks before a project or a PI is hoping to start up their project. So we get a bit more lead time, and it allows us to have a bit more of a high touch interaction with researchers to bypass some of the communication issues that we encounter with the forms. So all of that to say that you might think that we are moving in a direction that takes us away from machine actionable, but we'll come back to and talk about how this is actually helping us think about how could we use these NIH DMS plans to better serve researchers. And I think I have another slide next. Thank you. Okay, so as we are talking through machine actionable DMPs at IU, we are breaking this up into the planning phase, so the proposal development phase, and then the implementation phase that will happen at project startup after notice of award has occurred. So at the planning phase, we think and would like to explore the integration of PID, so persistent identifiers, within data management and sharing plans. Now we're using this platform called Fireform, and I'll explain a bit more about that later. But if we include those, then that helps us down the road to connect some of the products back to the award. Now, is it going to fully enable us to track all of those data outputs? No. Is it a step in the right direction? We hope. It could, what another sort of machine actionable step we're looking at is, depending on how folks submit their data management and sharing plan, whether it is identifying something in the free text or we have a structured response field, we could potentially route that entire DMP to the appropriate services that they have mentioned for review, so that before this DMS is sent in or before it gets finalized, ideally, it's the more important piece of it, during the sort of a negotiation, that we have a chance to take a look at whether what the PI is promised is feasible. So there is this sort of smoothing of the routing process for review by the appropriate service units. And then finally, hopefully by sharing these submitted and successful DMSs, service groups can actually plan more effectively and understand how much data they might have coming down the pipeline in the next 2 to 3 years. Now that is a bit more of a stretch goal. We're not, that will take some more work to make actionable. But the hope is that this is also an information gathering resource for the service leads. And on the implementation side, similar to things that Nicole has already described, notifying when a notice of award is submitted to the institution, letting those service groups know, okay, this commitment is now in place. Let's take another look at it. Do we need to revise? Are there things that need to be figured out with the PI and the team? It could also allow us to make these commitments more visible to leadership. So not just to the PIs, but also their department chairs, their associate deans and vice chairs for research, so that they understand the level of resources that the research is actually consuming or requiring. And then finally, we're hoping that eventually we can get to more granularity around when particular actions might need to take place um, at the notice of award. So this will depend on the level of on the various service units, but one way that we're doing some of this work with other data in the institution is a Denodo dashboard or a Denodo platform. So it's a way to make data available to various folks. You can create a dashboard that queries data, and you can tightly control access to views. So that is one thing that we might be able to do, is to allow people to query these and get a sense for issues that are very specific to their service group. And just to respond to the question in chat, Fireform is an internal electronic workflow system. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. And I think that is it for me.
Great, thank you. So now we're going to where we actually are. Yeah, okay. So Heather, you get to keep going.
Thank you, sorry. Okay, so this is where you'll see a little bit more of what Fireform looks like. So currently, we have a school level requirement within the School of Medicine that is required post-award. So every project should have a DMP submitted annually. Now the details of that are sort of described elsewhere, so I'm not going to go into that too much here. But just note that because this is post-award, we've been able to use this Fireform system to harvest data from other systems, like our grants award database, like our payroll database, to minimize the burden on PIs or whomever is filling this out. So that they're not doing a lot of manual data entry for data that's already existing somewhere else. Now, we got a lot of feedback early on that people were really resistant, and they had this perception that a lot of the things that we were asking for in this form already existed, and that was not the case. But where we could, we integrated and pulled data in so that they didn't have to enter so much. That is both a good thing and a bad thing. So as we switch to a pre-award template, we're going to see, I think, some similar challenges and issues expressed by researchers that it just requires a lot of them, right? And so while these sort of structured fields give us useful information that we can then make machine actionable, the template itself from NIH is not structured in that way. So we're currently in the conversation of how can we help researchers create an NIH compliant plan without losing some of these valuable structured pieces of data. Okay, so next slide, please. Thank you. And so where we might actually have the most potential around converting the information that we're gathering into actionable information, like right off the bat, is around storage. So we have a structured field in our existing template that asks folks, where do you plan to store data for this project? We have various service leads, and if there is a platform that is not listed here, they can sort of note it in an other. But these are generally systems that are managed within IU or by IU. So even the cloud-based, it's an IU tenant, it's an IU license. We have people who sort of ensure the security aspects of that. So one thing that we could do pretty quickly is, when folks indicate that they plan to use these systems in a proposal, upon notice of award, we could forward this information to that service lead and let them know. They could have a conversation. They could initiate the conversation with an investigator and make sure, A, that things have not changed, because we know that budgets sometimes get cut. that projects often change upon implementation and throughout, but also that we can begin to understand some of the struggles that researchers face as they are planning and implementing projects that cannot, frankly, be captured in a form. So this is one place I think where we can sort of start immediately to think about how can we use information gathered in these plans to both connect researchers with the support services, but then also provide useful information to the services themselves so that they can be better prepared for what's happening and not be surprised when a researcher has 5 terabytes of data or petabytes. Um, okay, and that is it. I think, let me just check. Yep. So really the bigger picture here is that as we think about machine actionable data management plans, I want to take a step back and remember and remind us that it's really not the goal in and of itself. The whole point is to improve support. So similar to the conversations that happen around open science and open access, why are we doing this? And so from my perspective, there are 3 sort of key reasons here. So one is that we want to refer researchers to the appropriate support services in a consistent, timely, and efficient way. And right now we are not doing that. It is very email heavy and communication is challenging. And so it's not always either as timely or as efficient as we would like it. We also want to equip researchers with the information they need to be successful. So where we can formalize documentation and answer questions in an asynchronous way, I think that these machine actionable DMPs could help us to direct folks in a more nuanced way to existing documentation. Whereas right now they're really encountering that when someone refers them to something specific or when they sort of stumble upon it on their own. And then finally, as I've mentioned, we want to enable service providers to learn from the information provided in these plans. Because it is not just a PI or research team commitment, it's a commitment on behalf of the institution. So those are our sort of 3 bigger picture goals. And I am going to turn it back over to Nicole.
Great. Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Oh my goodness. So I skipped ahead in my notes. So this slide really just provides some examples of how we might do that. So around the data type field, this could be where we take either a sort of a regex approach and we identify, do they mention these platforms in the free text? And then if so, they get referred to the appropriate service, or we could retain some of the structured fields alongside the free text response area and use that to route the referral or the DMP for review. Similarly, it's really difficult right now to provide sort of predefined guidance around preservation, access, and timelines. So if someone wants help and wants someone to take a look at their plan, again, the easiest thing for us is probably to just ask them, would you like someone to take a look at this? And then route it appropriately there based on their campus, their school, to the appropriate librarian. And then finally, we know that sort of the access, distribution, and reuse considerations tend to be emergent from multiple issues. It can depend on the kinds of data involved. It can depend on the level of data classification. It could depend on the funder requirement. So specifically, if there's a particular program requirement where the baseline expectations are a little bit higher, we might need multiple teams to look at that. And that might be a scenario in which a dashboard view that is accessible by multiple service groups or multiple units could be more effective than routing it separately to those folks. So these are some ways in which the information captured within these plans might become machine actionable within the infrastructure that we have currently at IU.
Great. Thank you. Okay. So I'm going to just be honest. NYU is nowhere near where Heather and her institution are We are at the beginning. So things that we have been doing since basically the beginning of this year. So we first built a team. I know one of these practitioner perspectives webinars talked a lot about that, so I won't talk about it too much. Just to say that we're coordinating across many departments. So this includes the Office of Science and Research, Legal, Research IT, various compliance offices, sponsored programs administrations, some informatics folks, and our shared resource cores. And all of these people have a lot to offer to this process as we try to figure this out, and in particular to try to understand the legacy systems at NYU. I am waiting for the day that I see a legacy system that uses COBOL at NYU, but I won't be surprised when I eventually find it. Okay, so second, okay. The second is to assess what to make machine actionable first. We've talked a lot about this process. We have some systems under consideration. The first is the research IT request forms. I'll say I'm very interested in making this happen first because I need a lot of buy-in from research IT in order to continue to work on this project. And I want to demonstrate to them how useful it can be. So that is pretty high on my list, but it's not necessarily where we're going to start. Repository submission support through the library. I've been doing a lot of work on this and how ways we might approach that. Also, our cores use various systems for things like requesting EHR data or requesting slide images. So we're looking at those as options as well. Those are very appealing because all of our cores already have documented data management processes. And because that sort of documentation is sort of hard to get a hold of for a lab by lab basis, and because our cores produce so much of the data at the institution, it's very appealing to look at those sorts of systems and see what we might be able to do there. And finally, developing guidance around these issues. So I've been working on a couple of interactive decision trees to help researchers better choose things like repositories and data analysis tools. These decision trees basically ask researchers about their project, their funding, their data, and tries to point them to a series of repositories that could be of use to them. It's a difficult process, but we're getting somewhere. And then also working with our institution's cores to develop guidance that mirrors their pre-existing data management protocols. So our cores have been very worried about researchers writing data management plans that do not match how they already manage those researchers' data. So we're working with them to develop guidance so that the cores aren't stuck trying to fulfill promises that they can't keep, and so that researchers are not surprised. So all of this is really a lot of communication building across departments. Okay, so moving forward, this is more of a brain dump, but I think it's good to talk about. These are things I'm keeping in mind while we're trying to plan this. As you can see, NYU, we're really at the beginning stages of this process. So this is what I'm keeping in mind as we try to battle this through. And the first is never let a good crisis go to waste. I'm no Winston Churchill, but I know I'm not going to be able to get research IT to do things for me unless it's a crisis. They have a lot to handle. Everybody at our institution, and I'm sure your institution, has a lot of things on their to-do list. The NIH has been quite kind to us by providing us a crisis, and I have no intention of letting that go to waste. And I think machine actionable data management plans have the promise of improving the work done at our institution and really the work lives of the people at our institution. So I want to take advantage of it. I want to leverage it for everything I possibly can. The second is to aim for partially machine actionable. I've been trying to call these PAMA DMPs, but I don't think it's going to take off. But that's basically the approach I'm thinking about, and to expand as it's proven helpful for our different departments. I'm really thinking about intermittent evaluation and strategy adjustment over time. I am looking at this process as both a, 1 year, let's get to compliance and do whatever we can before January 2023, but also a 5-year program that we can really use to improve our processes. The third one here is to consider how legacy systems can talk to new systems. At the beginning of this talk, I mentioned that infrastructure isn't just a series of systems, but also the relationships between those systems. And so that's something I really have to keep in mind as we're doing this planning. I am not going to aim for one system to rule them all, like one data management system for an institution. In part, our research data is far too diverse for that. And second, I don't know if you'd ever get buy-in, but interoperability across these systems is still ambitious, but I think it might be attainable, and that's what I'm aiming for. Understanding that inefficiencies sometimes have their own benefits. I am all for automating when possible, making people's lives easier where possible. But a lot of times when something is inefficient, it gives us time to pause. It gives us time to think, to refer people to other departments. And when we're building out and trying to automate things, really thinking about if there are other purposes these inefficiencies that we're trying to get rid of serve. Try to make that concrete. In New York now, you can go to like an Amazon corner store where you can scan things in and you don't actually even have to scan it. Or you can go to your corner store where the guy knows you and will make your favorite sandwich. And the corner store is more inefficient, but that inefficiency has its benefits. So I want to also keep that in mind. I should have eaten lunch before this. I'm sorry. Second to last, is to leverage the work done by the larger community. So things like DMP tool to serve your institution. We're going to be using DMP tool at NYU. I'm really grateful to everybody who's been doing work there. I mentioned the RDA Common Standard. That's been something I've been looking at a lot and really considering. There's a lot of people doing a lot of really great work around machine actionable data management plans. And I would suggest, and I am trying to leverage that work done and really come to understand their goals and see where we can make things work for our institution. And lastly, I'm trying to create space for innovation and experimentation moving forward. I've mentioned that there's a lot, I see this as a really long-term plan, and that's partially why machine actionable has to happen. But when I say this, and I think Heather sort of alluded to this and has sort of mentioned to it, once we start getting a bunch of data management plans from funded projects at our institution, that is a large corpus of information for us to work with, and we could learn a lot from it. So one of the things I have in mind is, especially 1 year out after this policy, is seeing if we can do work with even natural language processing or even something simple like text search to get a better idea of what our researchers are doing and building space for innovation, because this is a body of knowledge that we've never had access to before, and that presents a real opportunity, I hope. So with that, unless Heather, do you have anything to add to my long list of brain dump related stuff?
No, I don't. And I think this is a good opportunity to begin conversations. And it could very well look very different at your institution, what a machine actionable sort of process would look like. And I think just having conversations with folks about where the pain points are is a valuable learning experience, because I would never have guessed, based on the initial conversation we had with folks about completing this sort of school level requirement that we've learned from, that they didn't have a shared understanding of what data access or data sharing was. There are some really basic things that you can solve, frankly, without fully automating or super fancy technology. So I'll just throw that out there. It does not have to be pretty and shiny and perfect from day one.
I'd have to agree. So we're now at the point where we can take questions. So what Heather and I did is we pulled together some questions for consideration for you all because we were kind of worried that it would be too much information all at once to just have, a blank questions question mark slide. But I see that we're getting things in the chat already, so maybe that was totally unnecessary. Let's take a look.
Do you want to touch on the text mining one?
Okay. I don't know. The tool I've been considering is what if I could hire a postdoc? That's the tool I've been considering. I'll continue to speak very frankly, which is that NYU has so much work to do ahead of January 2023 that I think, doing that text mining work is basically going to be a year out from that. And at that point, with the amount of that might as well be 10 years from now, according to my brain space right now. But that is where I would like to be.
And I'll just jump in and say, so we did a qualitative analysis of the free text responses from the school level data management plans that we had submitted, and we presented a poster on that at RDAP earlier this year. And it wasn't beyond conceivability that you could have two people look at them and sort of code and make notes on them. I think we had something like 680 plans submitted times 6 response fields that were free text. And there is value to having people read and discuss that information, right? So yes, you could certainly do text mining, but if you have a smaller subset, it doesn't mean that you have to have the technology to learn from those. So yes, text mining is useful. It's not the only solution to getting information out of those.
Yeah, I'd have to second that entirely, where using what's available to you is always a good idea. And it's fun to talk about things like text mining and NLP because it feels new. And I would love to have a person to work with who could show me new things. But if you can do something simpler that can impact your institution well, yeah, let's do it. I'm going to talk to Joan H. I would be more than willing to share those decision trees. I would also be willing to take volunteers who would like to work on this through the NCDS. Elisa Circus and I have been talking about that, so I can send out an email through the NCDS to get volunteers for that, because I'll be honest, it is more than a one-woman job. All right. Heather, do you have thoughts on Paul Levitt's question? Do you know?
We
Here,
haven't seen
I'm
any
gonna,
specific tech requirements. Sorry, go ahead.
oh no, I'm just going to read it out loud because I realize there's live captioning happening.
Yes.
And that's, do you know if a part of the DMS policy compliance, NIH will require PIs or more likely their postdoc students may need to provide an electronic lab notebook to document their data storage requirements, repository location, how it is structured, etc., maybe using OSF or Jupyter notebooks?
Yeah, so our read of it is that there are no particular technologies required, in part because the range of research being conducted by NIH funded folks is enormous. And so you have people using clinical trial systems, EDC, very structured data capture, and then you have paper forms, right? So particular programs might, but I don't see it in the policy. Nicole?
Yeah, I haven't seen that in the policy. I'm also just realizing that live captioning turns sound into text, not the other way around. So excuse that brain fart. My apologies. Yeah, I don't think there are specific requirements along those lines.
Somebody has a question about the interoperability between DMPs. For instance, our internal FireForm system versus DMP tool. What if PIs move institutions? Yes, absolutely, that is a concern. I will say that we tend to get more investment from researchers with locally managed systems because they can tend to be a bit more responsive to the particular needs of our researchers. Now, that may or may not be fact, that might just be perception, right? But we had a resource available to us, and at the time, DMP tool, this was pre NIH final policy release. So at the time, DMP tool did not suit our needs. We are also looking at it to see if there's a way that we could be compatible. But frankly, one of the conversations we've had associated with this policy is who is responsible for reviewing these plans before they get submitted. And our IU system-wide research administration group does not have the capacity. So it's falling on schools and departments. And so that requirement to potentially have schools or departments look at these before they go in means that we need an internal routing function. And I don't know if that makes sense. But I think there are going to be some logistical things in which a universal tool might not be effective now. It could be in 2 to 3 years.
Okay. I'm going to tackle Lauren's question. Are we trying to get the entire grant application to be machine actionable or just the DMP section? How do we want to integrate an MA DMP with a non-MA overall grant application? I am just concerning myself with the data management plans. If they want me to do the whole grant application process, I don't know. I'm going to need a lot more than what they're giving me now. I think what's valuable about our situation with the DMPs is that for the NIH, this is new. And for our researchers who are NIH supported, it is new. And that newness really does give us this opportunity to try to form how we're building infrastructure around this new requirement. To do the entire grant application seems much more difficult, not just because it's bigger, but because there's so much more history there. And those legacy systems, which can be helpful but also troublesome, would present far more of a challenge. For the second half of your question, I'm not sure. You know, an MADMP has a lot of possibilities when it's not just a static document, but it's very possible that within the overall grant application, it will be submitted as a static document. DMP tool allows you to export data management plans in a variety of formats, including JSON and PDFs. So it's possible that just within the grant application, you've got a PDF, and then on the back end, you're using the JSON to do something a little bit more advanced.
Yeah, I will sort of echo what Nicole said and just say it's kind of like ORCID, right? So the information and the data is created in a portable, structured way so that it can be pushed out to various places. So Fireform, our current template in Fireform allows you to export as a PDF, and that is what our contracts and grants unit is going to be. That's how they expect the DMS plans to be submitted. It has to be incorporated into the budget justification section, so it has to be a PDF. But that doesn't mean that that limits how it's created, right? So just like ORCID allows people to push data associated to your profile, and you can do what you will with that data in a number of ways. So can we look at machine actionable DMPs if we destructure some of these pieces? And I think one of the interesting sections that's ripe for this is the standards piece, and the related tools and software piece. So those are places where potentially there are lots of DOIs that already exist there, and could we integrate and store those DOIs in a way that is more useful than a list of links in a PDF?
Okay, just going to respond to Paul, your comment here. Just something to keep in mind about compliance here is a DMP is written with the grant application. So you're not going to have DOIs when you're writing your DMP. You will have to say, you know, it will be deposited in X repository and other researchers can access it at that repository.
But that may be something that you're asked to provide during the reporting phase. So that is where a full citation to the data sets or a DOI or both would be expected, not in the DMS plan. Yeah. Let's see.
I can't speak to Amy's question on the NSF DMP guidance because I'm not deeply aware of it. Are you by any chance?
Nope, I'm not.
Okay, sorry, Amy. Question from Tess. Are your institutions anticipating that you'll need to increase long-term data? Oh, yes. Or data storage options available for researchers? Yes. It's a funny balance between explaining to them that they should use NIH resources and also that they need to start building up their storage options. But yeah, that's going to need to happen. And also, I think some further guidance on what level of data will need to be stored, particularly from some of our basic science researchers. It's a little unclear.
Yeah. The other thing I will add to that is we also need better tools to help researchers determine what to keep.
Yeah.
So I mean, for many of our folks, once the active period of the project is over, the intention is not to keep all of it. While they might do that in the short term, once they begin to run into storage quotas, which is happening, they either will delete or they'll put it on like less stable sort of external hard drives that eventually that data is going to get lost. So we need to help them make better decisions about what to actively archive and preserve.
I couldn't agree more. I'd also add, it's not just we, but also the NIH, because sometimes this is outside of my realm. Leslie sent a question to me privately, I think mistakenly, but I'll say it out loud. Are either or both of your institutions requiring researchers to provide the DMP to the university? I'll note DMP tool, I am an administrator of it, thanks to my colleague Genevieve Milliken. So I can see all the DMPs that will be created through DMP tool. They will be submitted through our grant application system, but they're not going to be required to be submitted separately outside of those processes. Heather, I think it might be different for you.
Well, so right now we're using an internal system, so they are available to the university. And in fact, because they're going to become a part of the term and condition of the notice of award, absolutely the university has to know what they're saying. The process by which they get access to that will probably be when they submit it to the, when they route the proposal in the contracts and grant system that we use, which is KC. So absolutely universities need to have visibility of these because it's part of the legal obligations that we'll have.
We have a comment on RSpace, and we only have 1 minute. I don't have any thoughts because I don't know enough about it. Heather, how about you?
Yeah, I don't have any thoughts on that either. I know we have some folks using it, but for the most part, it's not widely adopted at my institution. Yeah. So I guess what we could say is if there are questions that you want to ask that we did not get to answer, feel free to email us.
Yeah, that sounds great to me. And Justin, I think we're all set if you want to close this out.
Thank you all so much. I'm putting some links in the chat. So if you please visit the evaluation form, leave some feedback for this session. And there's a final session that we're hosting with folks from NIH to speak directly on the policy and to do a longer question and answer period. So if you have more questions on this, please visit us on May 24th, and the link is in the chat as well. All right, thank you, everybody.
Thanks for watching. This video was produced by the network of the National Library of Medicine. Select the circular channel icon to subscribe to our channel, or select a video thumbnail to watch another video from the channel.